Welcome to GS Podcast number 122. I'm Stephen Knight. I hope you're all good. It's absolute chaos in England at the moment. I truly think we may be in the end times. The sun's been out for at least 3 weeks now. It's confusing for the locals. As a matter of fact, I think a few people have started trying to throw spears at it. England's doing well in the World Cup, which may not be the case by the time this podcast comes out. And looks like the Tory government's falling apart. So, uncertain times. What isn't uncertain, however, is how good my guest is for this episode. I'm very pleased to welcome Mohammed Syed back to the podcast. He's been on before. He's one of the co-founders of Ex-Muslims of North America. Fantastic work, very professional. I really love the work he's doing with the help of Sarah Hayder as well, who's also been on the show. These guys, I think, if you're really invested in the God debate and the collision between human rights and religion, this is where it's at with the ex-Muslims. They're the first line of defence, really. It's one extra layer of difficulty. It's an extra layer of challenges and personal risk to stand for these Enlightenment values as somebody from a culturally Muslim background. So we'll get into that, what the difference is, and why it's important that we support vocal ex-Muslims. And there's a way you can do that if you live in the New York area. There will be a panel with some excellent speakers on. Aliyah Rizvi, friend of the podcast, author of The Atheist Muslim, Ibn Warwick, author of the incredibly popular book Why I Am Not a Muslim, and Mohammed Syed himself will be there as well. So that's on the 21st of July in Midtown Manhattan, and I wish I could be there. All the cool stuff seems to be happening in the States at the moment, which is deeply irritating. So if you're going and you listen to this podcast, let me know you're going. I'd like to hear from you once you've been to the event as well. Let me know what you think. I'm hoping they'll release some videos to it at some point. But if you want to get tickets, and I highly recommend you do, you can find them on Eventbrite, or you can go straight to the Ex-Muslims of North America webpage, which is EXMNA.org. If you've got any feedback you want to send to Mohammed after our conversation, any questions for him, you can find him on Twitter at MoTheAtheist. Don't forget, this podcast is entirely audience supported. I'm very fortunate to have an audience whereby I get thousands and thousands and thousands of downloads per episode. However, I think at last check, something like 224 people supported the show via Patreon, which is fantastic, and I'm very lucky. But if that doubled, I could probably just do this full time, produce more content, invite more guests, get to more events, have the freedom to go out and report, and just be the voice you want on the ground more often than I am. It's difficult to balance the day job with what has become a very involved and time-consuming secondary job, and I want to keep doing it. So the best way to help support this podcast, or my YouTube channel, or my blog, or my tweets, whichever appeal to you most, is to head over to patreon.com/gspellchecker. From there you can pledge $1 a month or $1 per content. You can set limits. You're entirely in control, and it makes a massive difference. So thank you very much to all my excellent Patreon supporters who would have got this episode quite a bit earlier than normal, as a very small thank you. Remember, head over to EXMNA.org to get your tickets for the event on Saturday the 21st. It looks like that's going to be excellent, and I'm really annoyed that I can't go. From Islam to Enlightenment, with Aliyah Rizvi, Ibn Warwick, and Mohammed Syed, who you're about to hear. You can keep up to date on this very podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spell took across the god of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help a look that don't know what it means, and he said, and go A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we're done.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Mohammed Syed from Ex-Muslims of North America back to the GS podcast. Mo, assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum. How's everything going?
Great, thank you. It's been a big year for me. I've actually converted to Islam since we last spoke, so that's going well. Yeah, and apparently if I change my mind, that's fine. No repercussions whatsoever. I can just basically hand in the receipt and we're all good. That's right, isn't it?
It is the religion of peace. What do you mean? Of course that's the way it is.
Okay, so it's been a while we've spoke, and I'm very pleased to see the Ex-Muslims of North America doing events now. Seems to be getting a lot more exposure, a lot more people are paying attention, your membership seems to be increasing, all positive stuff. Maybe you could explain to my listeners a little bit about the mission statement of Ex-Muslims of North America. What is it that you're hoping to achieve with the organization?
So Muslims don't generally encounter doubt, and as a result of that, apostasy is very, very stigmatized in most Muslim countries and communities, and we're trying to change that. We're trying to make it easier for people that are leaving Islam, because a lot of people are leaving Islam every day in every community and country. And as the ability to speak up about their experiences and the problems they have with religion, to a great extent, we hope that will moderate Islam. So we're trying to make that transition easier, trying to enable people to speak up about their issues and generally make life easier for everybody.
Great. So, I mean, reaching out to people with doubt, and I imagine there's quite a lot of people within, quote unquote, Muslim communities who have got doubts, who may even completely outright reject the faith, but there's a lot of societal pressure within them communities to adhere to Islam. It can be very difficult in terms of just the family situation if you want to publicly espouse non-belief. And so do you get a lot of people who are quite scared about being exposed to their family who come to you for support?
Yeah, that's generally the case. The good thing is that as more and more people are coming out, and we're doing a video series, we're doing a campus tour to expose that more, people are feeling more empowered. So it started to change where a few years ago when we started, you didn't encounter anybody that was ex-Muslim in the public sphere, and now you encounter hundreds of people speaking up on their own. And that's sort of starting to change the dynamic where families themselves and communities themselves are cognizant of the fact, and they're trying to do something to prevent it from happening, which to me is a very promising sign.
That's excellent. So you've got an event, it's next month, isn't it, in New York, a panel arranged. Maybe you could tell me a little bit about who's speaking there and what you're hoping to get from this event.
So one of the primary things that we will be speaking about is the rise of ex-Muslims in general. And the people that are there, I'll be speaking Ibn Warraq and Ali Rizvi. Ibn Warraq is, I think, one of the longest active ex-Muslims in the public sphere. He started writing in the 90s. He wrote one of the first books on the topic, Why I Am Not a Muslim. Yeah. He's written about 9 books so far, and he's still going strong. I think his latest book came out last year. He's a force. He's one of the most well-known academics in this topic.
Wasn't he didn't do public appearances for a while, did he? He remained anonymous.
Yeah, exactly. Because of threats, Ibn Warraq is actually a pseudonym for the same reason, right. But he's... As the climate has started to improve, he's, over the past few years, been willing to be more open about it and has been receptive to doing public events. He actually was a part of something, I think I'm forgetting what the acronym meant, but it was called ISIS a decade ago before the new ISIS, which was about secular Islam and trying to reform Islam.
That's unfortunate, isn't it?
Yeah. But they had a summit about secularizing Islam, I think in 2007. He was there, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Irshad Manji, a bunch of other thinkers. So we're going to have him in New York, and then Ali Rizvi is coming down from Canada as well. You may know, he wrote the book, The Atheist Muslim. It's more of a popular read, and I would recommend for most people to read it. He talks a lot about the experience of leaving Islam and being in a Muslim context, how that affects you, how your families react, and holding on to the traditions often associated with that. So I'm really looking forward to the panel itself.
Yeah, I really like Ali. I've read his book. I've had him on the show a couple of times to talk about it, and it's a great idea, isn't it? This idea that we can have culturally Muslim atheist in a sense. I mean, how do you feel about that in terms of, leaving Islam, but maybe there's some scope and wriggle room to still enjoy a lot of the customs and positive things about the religion? Is that something you feel that you can get on board with, or are you kind of draw a line between the two things kind of guy?
So I personally draw a line between the two things. One is, and Muslim necessarily is, by definition, acceptance of faith.
Right.
But my position is the only position around, and the only position that people are allowed to have. That's the joys of freedom. People have a variety of experiences and opinions, and they can pick and choose how it works for them.
You fascist.
I try. In this atmosphere, that's what you're supposed to do, right?
Well, let's talk, just as a clumsy segue from that to this. We've seen a lot of disruptions at public talks recently, talks of controversial topics or speakers. People who don't fit into the mainstream narrative tend to attract a lot of negative attention and controversy, and there's a lot of efforts at disruption and deplatforming. And I imagine that in certain spheres, given how much the ex-Muslim movement's demonized by not only certain Muslims, but non-Muslim leftists as well. Have you run into any of this animosity from people on campuses or at events who are just hell-bent on trying to close your message down?
Quite frequently.
Wow.
So on campuses, it's often Muslim student groups or left-wing groups that are concerned about why we're speaking, and they associate anybody saying anything against Islam as hateful. Beyond that, we also hold all off-campus events, and even there, so the last time we had an event in New York, it was at a hotel that we had a room booked in, and the hotel the last day got cold feet. Called us and canceled the event, and they kind of cited security concerns. So we don't know exactly what happened, but our perspective is that probably they got threats or they got calls asking them to cancel the event because all the agreements were signed, everything was done. Had been marketed for about a month before they canceled.
It's really interesting that, because one of the things I love about the ex-Muslims of North America is you're very critical, you're very active, but you're professional. You and I've spent a bit of time speaking to Sarah on the show and lucky enough to meet her in person, and you just seem like a very level-headed bunch when you speak, and they seem to be portraying talks of this kind as almost far right or extremist. So how do we get to a point where we have a sort of a minority group within a minority, the ex-Muslims, trying to express themselves in similar terms to Christian dissidents have throughout, the last couple of 100 years in the West, a great celebration, and that's being chalked off as extremism?
Some of it has to do with the political climate right now. The other part of it is it's presumed, and I would say it's somewhat racist by people on the left, that religion is an immutable characteristic of certain people. Yeah. And therefore criticizing it as a criticism of those people rather than reason and rationality, something that is for all humanity and everybody can embrace. So it's sort of, we need to educate, I would say, people that have those regressive perspectives to pull out of it. And we've often seen that at the talks we've had where people have come and they come with a very different perception. And we've even had people that have come to disrupt, but didn't know how to disrupt because they couldn't find anything offensive enough to disrupt. One of the funnier incidents was we had a talk at MIT, and there were a few Muslims that attended the event, and so they asked a few questions that were antagonistic, but they weren't able to gain any traction because what we were talking, as you said, was pretty level-headed. At the end, there was some other person on the mic asking a simple question, and they started screaming and walked out. And this poor young kid was confused. What did I say? I didn't do anything.
It's all this frustration, and I think they've concocted an enemy in their head that doesn't exist.
Exactly.
I must have said this a million times now, and I was a bit naive when I first started poking my toe in this whole God debate. And I didn't know much about Islam, to be honest. It's something I've got more interested in over the years. But I used to see how my social circles and my fellow leftists and liberals used to champion ex-religious people, even ex-clergy. People would be on the street with, placards about "fuck the Pope." The Catholicism is homophobic. Christian religion hates women, and that'd get high fives within leftist liberal circles. The hippies loved that stuff. But so then when I started seeking out similar dissidents in the Muslim faith and looking into how they had to live and what they got for their troubles, it was really quite eye-opening. So if you've got two almost like-for-like experiences in terms of trying to emancipate yourself from an old patriarchal, homophobic ideology, and one group is being celebrated by leftists and one is being demonized, are you saying that, that comes down basic to a sort of leftist, racist attitude towards Muslims, that their faith is integral to their identity?
A part of it is that, yes. I would say even Orientalism is viewing them as inherently different. Some of it also has to do with what's in vogue right now. Atheism was in vogue in the past. At the moment, it's viewed as stepping out of line. One of the issues atheists in general have from a political perspective is we tend not to toe the line. Being skeptics, we question everything. And from a political party perspective, you want people that toe the line. So we're inconvenient in general. So that plays into it a little bit. The other part of it is with the rise of terrorism and anti-Muslim bigotry. There's a desire, which is a positive thing, to protect people, and then being unable to distinguish between people and their bad ideas. So if somebody holds bad ideas, should they be protected? My perspective is yes, of course. We protect all individuals. Everybody has civil liberties. And a lot of people have trouble distinguishing that. So if I'm protecting somebody, they must essentially be good. So they project their good intentions onto bad ideas.
Yeah. Well, we're having this conversation in the context of a Trump presidency, and it still seems amazing. Every time I say that out loud, that Donald Trump is the president of the United States, it seems like all my atoms try to resist it. But I was wondering, because a lot's been made about his quote-unquote Muslim ban, so maybe I could get your opinion on that as well. But there's the popular rhetoric is that his election has ramped up the anti-Muslim sentiment, the anti-Muslim rhetoric and hate. And I would imagine if an anti-Muslim arsehole is going to attack a Muslim for what reasons that they perceive a person to be a Muslim, you're in the firing line as well. You're non-white. You call Muhammad. It's bad news if you're in the company of an anti-Muslim bigot, I think. So I was wondering, have you seen any increase in that, and what's been your experience since the election of Trump?
Personally, I haven't, but in general, that has increased. But it's a bit of yin and yang in the sense that while it has increased, the other side also acting out in defense of Islam has increased as well.
Yeah.
So the underlying problem isn't being addressed by either side. One is trying to demonize people, the other is trying to celebrate a bad idea. Unless we actually resolve this issue, it's not like anybody believes that tomorrow terrorism will go away or any of the problematic aspects of religion tomorrow will magically disappear. Instead of addressing the problem, both sides are largely making noise that is irrelevant to the conversation.
It's a really interesting thought, that, because Trump got a lot of support on the back of his rhetoric towards Islam and Islamic extremism, and people thought, certainly supporters thought, he's the guy that's going to finally cut through all the PC nonsense, point the finger at Islamism for what it is, and solve this problem. But from what you're saying there, it may seem that the election of Trump, given who he is representing these ideas, has actually increased support for Islamic ideas.
To a great extent, yes. So there was a phenomena right after 9/11 where conversions to Islam increased in America. I wouldn't be surprised if something similar was going on. There isn't data on that yet, but sympathies increase, and therefore people look at it more sympathetically, and that causes a larger effect. On the other hand, if you're a Trump supporter and you want Islam to be addressed and you're concerned about the issue, he's not doing that. Simply banning people or calling something negative doesn't cause reform, doesn't cause people to change. We need to address the ideas at the heart of the issue. And he's not the person to cook for that.
Yeah, you just feel that if at the time of that election there was some left-leaning, charismatic liberal who, ticked all the boxes in terms of individual liberties and, being pro-choice and, being for free speech, but also recognised a problem with Islam and spoke about it in very sensible terms. You just feel like that's a better antidote to the problem than someone like Trump, except that person doesn't appear to exist on the political scene as far as I can see.
A slightly more honest Obama.
Yes. Yeah.
What's funny is that with Obama, like he gave an interview at the end of his second term, I think it was in Atlantic, talking about Islam and he was pretty frank. You could see that he recognizes what the problem is. He spent some time in Indonesia, so he had some first-hand experience. He talked about, for example, the niqab and the growth of it, and he made the connection that as it grew, fundamentalism and those two things are linked. They're indicators. And so he understood the problem. He just, due to political reasons, never was willing to address it.
Yeah, I mean, that's because he's secretly a Muslim, as we all know.
Who isn't? Who isn't?
Yeah, it's interesting that because it's kind of like there's almost a commitment to espousing a desired truth on Islam. They seem to think that if they pretend hard enough that it's quote-unquote nothing to do with Islam or that Islam is the religion of peace, maybe we'll, accident our way into that becoming a reality, which seems almost suicidal to me. We touched briefly on the Trump Muslim ban. I just wanted to get your take on that because there seems to be, a lot of people screeching about it as if all Muslims are banned from America. Then there are other people who will apologize for it and say it's not really a Muslim ban because A, B, and C. And I just wanted to get your perspective on it.
So literally, it is not a Muslim ban because they have it's on a country basis, for example. And then you have but going back to my original point about effectiveness, it isn't even doing what it's claiming to be doing.
Yeah.
His rhetoric was originally a Muslim ban, and then when it came to a legal perspective, that's not possible to do legally, so that was never mentioned. But Saudi Arabia is the primary purveyor of terrorism, both from a financing perspective and 9/11. Most of the people that attacked America were Saudi. Saudi Arabia is not on that list. Trump has great connections with Saudi Arabia. He would never go against it. So it's largely show. It's not actually doing anything. It's not addressing the actual issue. It's trying to appease people.
Yeah, theatre, isn't it, a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, just as a side note, we really we love our football or soccer in the UK, and we're really enjoying the World Cup at the moment. And a very large bar chain does a number of restaurants and pubs across the UK. They had loads of flags up on their bunting around the pub and on the interior, celebrating all the teams that were in the World Cup. And they just announced yesterday, I believe, that they're removing the Saudi Arabia flag. And I got a bit annoyed at first because I assumed they were doing it on humanitarian grounds. I thought that they're
Protest, probably.
Yeah, and I just thought that seems unfair to me. But when I looked into it, they were actually doing it because they deemed that flag to be placed in the context of alcohol to be inappropriate. So we're getting sort of pub chains in the UK enforcing a strange conservative Islamic blasphemy law. And, let's be honest, that they're not getting the lion's share of their money from Muslims. It's not, the alcohol business isn't big there. And I just wondered, how do you view what's going on in Europe with the problem we seem to have, not only with really ingrained Islamic conservatism being almost the norm in these communities and the extremism we have on the top of that? I can imagine it could look quite concerning to outsiders looking in.
It is concerning. And to dwell on the bar chain, the issue with blasphemy is that how do you change perspectives? You push beyond that. You blaspheme even if it upsets people, particularly if it offends people. That is how things change. That is how things changed in Europe, in England. Heresy was a thing. Blasphemy was a thing. There were laws on the books. People challenged them anyways. People went to jail. They pushed and pushed until they were able to change public perception. Instead of trying to do that and trust, we have people that are enjoying the fruits of centuries of people fighting back, becoming willing conspirators in this, if you will. It's sad.
It's very strange. I don't think they realize what they're doing here at all, do they? They're basically non-Muslims, essentially, and they're enforcing conservative Islamic dogmas. They're saying that Muslims as a whole don't drink alcohol, and any good Muslim would refuse to. And they don't seem to do this with Christians. Nobody's questioning whether or not Christians are consuming shellfish or wearing mixed fibres or going to church every week. And we kind of leave that alone. But it makes sense to me that sort of conservative Muslim societies would enforce these rules and dogmas, but it doesn't make sense to me that my non-Muslim brethren are telling other Muslims what they must do in order to be a Muslim. And I kind of wonder whether or not it's too late at this point to try and change our attitudes in Europe. I don't know if you've got any more hope on this problem than me.
No, I disagree entirely. If we can't change the attitudes in a free Europe, we certainly can't change them in Saudi Arabia. Then civilizationally, we have to give up on 1.5 billion, 2 billion people. I disagree with that entirely. We need to educate these people that. So what this bar did was essentially they allied themselves with the far right on the Islamic side. And if they want to do that, fine. You want to be allies of far right religious extremist perspectives? Good for you. But you should be called out for that. That is who you are. It's not tolerance. It's not being a good citizen. It is the polar opposite of that.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I think the problem is we don't have that societal mechanism in place where Islam's concerned. So even if we so much as found out a UK business refused to wave a pride flag, that business would be in newspapers, there'd be social media campaigns, people would start downvoting it on TripAdvisor. There'd be a media storm surrounding that. But there seems to be no comparative social action when we have bigotry under the guise of Islam or people supporting conservative Islamic dogmas. And I just don't know how. I agree that educating people is the way. I agree that more awareness raising is the way, but I just don't see what else can be done to open people's eyes to this, what you've just said there, which would probably come as a shock to a lot of people. You've turned Islamism as far right there, which I completely agree with. However, that terminology for that problem's not nowhere near mainstream. No one, when you say far right anywhere really, people assume the white skinhead throwing Nazi salutes. So I mean, how better can we be in terms of getting people to understand that Islamic conservatism is pretty much far right as well?
So one of it is a lot of people, and this is a human issue, are very self-centered. You view the world from your goggles, your perspective, and from a European perspective, from an American perspective, the people that matter are the majority that are white, that are from a Christian heritage. So it's hard for them to look beyond that. And that needs to change. The world is much larger than 1.5 billion people that are white. And we need to look at the rest of the world and what they've gone through, their histories and what they're suffering through, and be allies of people that are liberal, that share our values, not simply people that look different than us based upon that. One of the other sides of it is that when things are changing, if you look at when things were changing in Europe, the people that were espousing liberal values or Enlightenment values or free speech or any of the things that we take for granted today, gay rights, they were an extreme minority. They fought, they changed perspectives, they changed the opinions of their fellow citizens. And on our end, we're starting that process. So of course you're going to be in the minority. Of course you're going to be like a single percentage point or 5 percentage points or whatever. You're not going to be the majority because you're trying to change the majority's perspectives, which are toxic. And for a lot of people, what the majority says is what goes. So within this brown community, if the majority says that religion is very important to us and it's wonderful and it's amazing and modesty doctrines are great for us, okay, that is what it should be. If the same thing was applied to a white community, a Christian background community, where being homophobic is part of their culture and heritage and it's existed for 1,000 years and that is how they identify, everybody would recognize that it was idiotic because it's a bad value. It doesn't matter what your history and heritage and culture is. We want to change that for a positive place for humanity itself.
Yeah, I agree. I wish I was as hopeful as you, but I shall keep plugging away regardless. I mean, maybe we could... Sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
We have to have hope. Without hope, we have nothing. One thing I would say that regarding hope is that ex-Muslims give me hope. So I don't gather much hope from white liberals. Sadly, I used to a decade ago before I started in this activism. But with ex-Muslims, there are so many of us now that are coming out, that are speaking up, and a lot of us recognize the problem. And that's generally how change happens, where people start speaking up within their communities and push for change, and that slowly but surely ripples out. And with the ex-Muslims, we see this a lot, where one person leaves, and as a result, one of their best friends leaves, and then turns out their sibling left, and then there's a liberalizing effect that grows outward very, very rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, that has been great to see over the last few years, especially. But I mean, do we think that being ex-Muslims enough? And by that I mean we've had sort of quote-unquote atheist communities, and what we see now is as this group grows, there's no sort of unifying factor in terms of political ideology or beliefs that sort of, coalesce and bring people together. We don't believe in God, but we have our own beliefs. And what we see there is quite a lot of fracturing and fallouts and infighting. And when I say infighting and fallouts, I mean mostly Americans. But that seems to happen a lot, and there seems to be different factions now. And I'm seeing that within the ex-Muslim quote-unquote community to an extent.
I haven't actually seen that much in the ex-Muslim community. There are one or two people that are largely on the outside that behave that way, but for the vast majority, I would say 90-95%, there isn't that sort of an issue, because a lot of us have gone through are in direct contact with conservative religion, and we understand the dangers it poses. One thing is that ex-Muslims themselves need to take on responsibility. We're the ones that can enact this change and can push forward and can help liberate a billion and a half, 2 billion Muslims. And it is on our shoulders. It's our fight. These are our communities. We can't be sitting around hoping that somebody else will come and save us. It's on us to make that necessary change. And that is hard, and that will involve sacrifice, that will involve a lot of hardship. But nothing worth having comes without that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I agree. I mean, how do you deal then with, I mean, given apostasy and death for leaving Islam is quite a big factor in the religion of peace, how do you then converse with somebody who feels that you don't deserve to exist by the very fact of you no longer wishing to adhere to Islam? Can you converse with somebody like that? Are you up for conversing with somebody like that?
That's another great point. From the perspective of an ex-Muslim, I would be willing to bet most every ex-Muslim knows somebody personally in their life like that. I have family members that believe that have said that to my face.
Wow.
It's a very common experience, but again, these aren't bad people. They just hold on to bad ideas, and they can be convinced out of it. And even if they themselves directly can be convinced out of it, those that surround them can be. And that changes their attitude. It's very easy to hate this random boogeyman of an atheist that is trying to destroy your child's future or their access to heaven. But when it's somebody you grew up with, it's your brother, it's a very, very different context. I have friends that I have since kindergarten that are Muslim. And we've been friends since then, and some of them are very conservative. But due to the fact they've known me throughout my entire life, it's hard for them to hate on me. BBC did a piece on, we're doing a campus tour that we've talked about, and BBC did a segment on it. And the first message I got was from one of these friends that lives in the Middle East that was, please be careful, I'm worried about you.
Right. Yeah. I think what happens as well with sort of fuzzy secular liberals like myself, we at least I used to, you kind of treat all religions the same, and you think that they're like for like. And I think there should be a greater focus on the specific problems you can encounter as a Muslim when you just decide that, you know what, I think I've had enough of this. I don't think it's for me anymore, because that's quite a common, rite of passage as a young Christian. I mean, you usually find that you get less religious as you get older, and you're free to then reject it. Whereas there are far more stigmas and consequences and, potential threats to your life just for doing the same thing in the context of Islam.
So one of the reasons I think people recoil is talking about it in the context of Islam. Islam is one faith. Islam isn't the only one that does these sorts of things. With Mormonism, you have a shunning doctrine where if people leave the faith, they're shunned. The Amish do that. Jehovah's Witnesses do that. It's more that religions that are very high control tend to treat their adherents badly when they step out of line, however they step out of line. One big differentiator with Islam compared to other ultra-Orthodox religions is that Islam holds state power in 50-odd countries, and that causes things to get a lot worse. But overall, the psychology, the reasons how they behave are very similar in all ultra-Orthodox faiths. One thing, though, that there was a recent Pew poll that came out in the U.S. that, going back to hope, that said that 23%, 1 in 4 people that were raised Muslim have left the faith. To me, that was an astoundingly large number. I'm an optimist. I'm full of hope in general, but that number was larger than I had anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, that really fascinates me, and I think there seems to be a vast difference between your American Muslim and your European Muslim, and I was just wondering what the difference is there. It seems to be, I don't know if it's a per capita issue or it's a multicultural issue, but we don't seem to be having the same sort of, a number of people leaving the faith in the UK or Europe, as you say. You mean that 1 in 4 statistic's fantastic stateside. So, I mean, what do you think the difference is there culturally between the American Muslim and the European Muslim?
So a couple of different things. One is that the percentage of Muslims in America is relatively low compared to, say, London or France. And it's easier to be exposed to divergent ideas when you're in a minority position. If you're in Luton in England, everybody you're surrounded with is Muslim. You don't come into contact with unorthodox ideas. So you're never challenged. You never are forced to confront the problems within your ideas. You were mentioning Sarah from our organization, and the reason she left Islam was that in high school, another angry atheist kid confronted her and said that your religion is stupid because of these verses in the Quran, and that forced her to reevaluate her religion and eventually leave religion as a result of that. But if you're surrounded, completely submersed in people that have identical thoughts as you, it becomes harder. One positive, though, is with the internet that's changing. Even in Pakistan, even in conservative Muslim countries where you won't encounter doubt publicly in any way, people won't speak about it because they'll be afraid. It's on the internet, it's everywhere, and it is penetrating Muslim communities, and they are getting concerned. I think last year in England, there was a conference, international conference, Losing Your Religion, where they had Muslim scholars from America, from a bunch of different countries, fly out and talk about this problem and how do we address the rise of atheism within our communities. And they're concerned, which is awesome. There was another one in Dallas this year in the U.S. I don't know if you know Yasser Qazi. He's a prominent Islamic scholar in the U.S. He last week did a post on Facebook attacking ex-Muslims.
Yes, I saw this. This was great.
Yeah, this is great. So they're not only being confronted by the issue, but they're being confronted by the issue enough that they're being forced to respond. What was funny with Yasser Qadi was that he was saying that leaving religion is not a rational problem, it's a spiritual one, and it's about submission to God. And okay, so it has nothing to do with rationality. So he has to dismiss that to begin with. And then his counterexample was that somebody came to him that had left Islam but rejoined because a family member had died. So that was his counterexample.
Right, okay. This is really interesting. So, I mean, this is progress of a sort, isn't it? Even if they're being forced to recognise that there are ex-Muslims, they exist, and they are a force to the point where they need to speak out against them now. So, I mean, I'm coming over to your hope side, Mo. I suppose in terms of hope, where we may lose it actually is on the issue of reform. Now, I'm guessing because you're the kind of guy who draws the line between the Muslim faith and being an atheist, and the two are quite incompatible in a sense. And reform to me seems like it entirely depends on being able to convince millions of people that Islam isn't Islam, and we have to make concessions and be very creative with interpretation to the point where it probably makes sense to just be a secular humanist rather than retain the Islamic identity. And I support the Islamic reform movement because the people behind it seem like terrific people. They seem like they're committed to individual liberty, to secularism, to freedom of expression, and I'm always going to get on board with that, whether they succeed or fail. But I was wondering if I could get your opinion on reform, what that might look like, and is it achievable?
I don't believe it's achievable. I think it's a fool's errand. But maybe 200-300 years ago, it would have been achievable. But in the modern world, the reason I think at least that Christianity reformed was that the the changes started happening in an era where humanity knew very little. Evolution as a concept did not exist. Our understanding of space, understanding of our presence, how we relate to the universe did not exist. In that, if you look at Thomas Jefferson, the idea of a deistic God, that makes sense when you don't understand. But the world we live in today is a very, very different world. And Islam is confronted with the past 500 years of scientific progress in one go. And it's very hard to, at that point, hold on to superstitions when atheism or a lack of belief in any divine gods is much more rational. And people tend to go for what makes sense, which is why when people say that, okay, let's discard this part of the Quran, which is a negative, be it wife beating, be it stoning, whatever, they need some sort of framework justification to make that make sense. And that doesn't really exist because Islamically, the Quran is perfect. It's a literal word of God directly dictated by through an angel to Muhammad. So it's hard to have half measures there.
Yeah, the transmission is a huge problem in terms of reform, isn't it? I mean, if we are going to get on board with this reform project, is it best, in a sense, to... I mean, I think what we're trying to do is, in a sense, try to get Muslims, if we can, to a more reasonable place in general. And I'm just wondering what the best tact is in terms of approaching people. Is it to basically try and convince them their faith is, bullshit and they'd be better joining the baby-eating atheist contingent? Or would it be best, in a way, to try and move them closer by means of trying to explain away some of the more conservative aspects? I mean, I think it's a toolbox approach myself. I come in and out of this. I have disagreements with people on it. But I was wondering, what do you think the best approach is? I mean, reform in that sense could be useful if it doesn't achieve out-and-out atheists, but moves them to a more reasonable place.
So at that point, what's the distinction between arguing for atheism and somebody being partially convinced versus arguing for them to be partially convinced to begin with? Why not argue about the end result, the things that we actually agree on and have evidence for, like science, than argue for half measures? And the thing is, for a lot of people, it's hard to take that final step. So they understand the problems within it, and they themselves stop acting religious, but they have trouble making that last step, saying that I don't really believe, but in action in their lives, they really do stop believing. A lot of women I know that when confronted with the problems with women's rights, with misogyny, with the violence against women within Islam, they pulled away from religion as a whole. You didn't have to argue that this part of Islam is right or wrong. The argument wasn't about this part of Islam is beautiful and you should keep this part. The argument was this part is wrong and immoral. What are you going to do about it? Yeah. And as a result of that pressure, people pulled back from their religiosity. A doubt was introduced into their lives where it didn't exist before. So our goal is to make them stroke the dissonance, make them see the flaws within their religion, the anti-human rights aspects of it, anti-science aspects of that. And what they do with that is on them. I don't see the point of starting with a half measure to begin with.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I mean, have you found that your approach to discussing this with Muslims has changed over the years? Because I imagine from someone who's an ex-Muslim, you know an awful lot about the faith. You're very, I mean, on the front of it, from their perspective, you could almost appear as a threat. You could be quite intimidating because you know the arguments and you know how to respond. And I imagine there's a lot of temptation on your side just to destroy anyone who tries to make an Islamically religious argument. And I was wondering, has your approach to people changed over the years? I mean, I know mine has, in terms of, I've gone from quite a firebrand atheistic way to realizing that you can nudge people if you try and understand them a bit more and you're a bit more civil. And I was just wondering, do you just tend to respond to the attitude you're getting, or do you have an approach now that you find works better than others?
So generally, being antagonistic on the face of it is not productive.
Yes.
But being honest is. So there's often a confusion between honesty and antagonism, because what we're saying is inherently antagonistic. So people want us to lie. But we can be honest about what we think and why we think it and why it's important, and understand their context as well and try to bridge that gap. People recognize that when you're sincere, even if they disagree with your position, that you're coming from a positive place and are trying to do what you believe to be right. People respect that inherently. So as long as we're honest and compassionate, I think that's what we need to do. often it's framed as it's a trade-off between honesty and compassion, which I disagree with.
Right. We have a bit of an issue in the UK with Muslim communities being very tight-knit. They kind of they can be quite controlling in that sense. So, if somebody steps out of line, perhaps it's a journalist within that community who's sort of exposing some extremism or other. There's certain people in that community who will try and close it down. They'll be in touch with the family of that person and try and get them to be quiet, things like that. And you're the face really of the ex-Muslim movement in like a Western sense, I would say at the moment. And do you find that there's a risk of people maybe posing as an ex-Muslim to try and find out more about your group and expose certain things or expose the members in there? And if so, what kind of security precautions are you able to enact to prevent that kind of thing?
So we don't talk in detail about the security aspects, but
Sure.
In general, we are aware that is an issue, and we've had attempts like that numerous times, and we've done as best as we can to try to mitigate that from happening. And so far, we've been successful over the past 5 years. That doesn't mean that it will always be successful. But the other side of it is that as more people are coming out and changing, the incentives to do that, to disrupt in that way, tend to go down because it's not as effective because there are already 1,000 people in the public eye. Going to a private support group of a few dozen individuals and try to disrupt that in a specific city won't really change anything. So as more people come out, it'll become easier. The other side of it is what you were talking about within communities where somebody is reporting on, say, a crime or like the grooming gangs issues or anything like that going on, and they themselves get into trouble. I think that also lies on both ex-Muslims and liberal and so-called moderate Muslims, that when something like that is going on, you need to stand up and you need to fight back. You need to support the person that is taking the risk. So when they're alone, it's very easy for them to fold and be silenced. When there are 100 people that have their back, even when they're attacked, they will have the courage to stand up and do the right thing. And it is a community issue. It is a larger issue that all of us need to work towards. I think that's one thing that ex-Muslims, at least within our organization and within the US, are succeeding greatly at, is by building up local support groups and communities where everybody interacts with and they know each other. When something goes wrong, you have a wide base of support there. And therefore, people feel empowered. So in the beginning when I started, I saw ex-Muslims that started speaking up but got backlash and pulled back and stopped writing and closed down their blogs. But now there are enough of us out there and they know each other that they have somebody to lean on when something goes wrong. They have somebody to call and vent their frustrations at. And the same needs to happen more in Muslim communities where are large groups of liberal Muslims that stand up for each other. And when they take the risk that needs to be taken, they know that they won't be alone.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think what needs to happen is when these liberal Muslims stick their head above the parapet now, other liberal Muslims reach out and offer support. So we're seeing more allyship in that sense. It doesn't feel like there are as many. I mean, I understand you spread thin, but it doesn't feel like it's just a handful of people anymore. It feels like your numbers are increasing all the time. So that's really positive to see. Okay, well, I do have a couple of questions from Twitter for you. Chris has asked a good question. He's asked, what is the quickest way to get a strict Muslim to question the Quran or their Islamic upbringing and maybe nudge them to be agnostic at the very least?
Ask them to go and read it. And if you really want to get them engaged, you can sit down and do it with them. And I've been talking about honesty, so this is not entirely honest per se, but talk to them that you want to understand the religion and you've got all these wonderful texts and you want to sit down with them and go through them together. And then you can have a conversation about the text together. You're learning, they're learning, and you're understanding this wonderful faith. And
such bait. That's excellent. Okay. Andrew G has asked, what, if anything, do you miss about the community you decided to leave?
I haven't really left it. Everybody I know tends to still be Muslim. My family is Muslim. So I haven't really left the community. I'm not as active in it, but I don't think I've lost any of the positives. I'm still associated enough that I don't see that.
Excellent. All right, Mohammed, it's been wonderful to speak to you again. It's been nice to get you back on the show. It's been too long. Maybe you could tell people a bit more about where they can get tickets for the event in New York.
If you go to our website, www.exmna.org, The first banner is to the tickets. The event is in New York, 21st July. If you're in the area, I'd highly recommend coming out. It's one of the biggest, best events we've had so far. I'm very excited about it.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to get across to my listeners before I let you get back to your morning?
Don't give up hope. Things are changing. I know it's easy for a lot of people, both on the Muslim, ex-Muslim, and even on the regular European side, to see that this is an intractable problem. But if you have any historical insight, it took hundreds of years for Europe to reform. We can do that in decades, but it will take decades. And you yourself have seen it over the past few years. Things have changed dramatically in just the past 5 years. Give it another 5-10 years, as long as we all get together and fight back and support reformists, support ex-Muslims, support doubt and dissent, things will change. It's up to us to make that change happen. It's easy to just cry that things are horrible. It's harder to do the actual work to make things different, to change things, but we can do that, and we will do that.
Yeah, I'm feeling hope. You know what? You've changed my mind. I'm pumped now. I'm hopeful. I'm ready for it. It's been great to have you. I really, really love and respect the work you're doing with ex-Muslims of North America, you and Sarah. You always have a very professional, level-headed approach to it, and that's really, really great to see. It's always something I feel like I can get behind. So if there's anything I can ever do to maybe give you a signal boost or offer a hand, I'd be more than happy to.
Thank you very much. It was great being back on again.
You're welcome. Cheers, Mo.
Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation, produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?